Alrighty, everyone. It is Friday, August 22nd, 2025. I am Michael Winkler, and this is the Mike Wink Show. Or maybe Squeaky Wheel. I haven't decided on the name change yet. Let's hop right into it today, talking about teachers. Oklahoma will soon require applicants from California and New York looking for teaching jobs to pass an exam to test their political leanings in a bid to prevent radical leftist ideology in schools. Oh boy. However, opponents call the assessment by the state's Republican-dominated education officials a MAGA loyalty test. I just think it's really funny, the idea that they would implement a rule like this for a radical left ideology, but not for radical right ideology. Like, you would think that if they were trying to appear impartial, that they would implement sort of both at the same time, but selectively enforce the radical leftist one more than the right wing one. But I guess back to what I've been saying for a while, consistency doesn't matter. Hypocrisy doesn't really matter anymore. PR and appearing to be in good faith in the way that you handle issues and whatnot doesn't seem to be part of the equation anymore. And so, yeah, they can just be like, yeah, we're just going to test for radical left ideology, but radical right wingers, they're fine. No, we don't care. The exam, which is administered by PragerU. Oh my God, are you serious? PragerU runs the exam for the Oklahoma public schools teachers. Oh my God, that's insanity, bro. That is actually crazy. The exam, which is administered by PragerU, an Oklahoma-based conservative nonprofit, was announced by Ryan Walters, Oklahoma's public schools superintendent, on Monday. As long as I am superintendent, Oklahoma classrooms will be safeguarded from the radical leftist ideology fostered in places like California and New York, Walters said in a statement. The exams are being finalized and will be released very soon, according to Quinton Hitchcock, a spokesperson for the state's education department. The assessment has 50 questions in total, with some of the questions asking applicants to write the first 3 words of the U.S. Constitution and answer why freedom of religion is important to America's identity. Isn't there rules about what kind of questions your employer are and aren't allowed to ask you in an interview? And I assume this exam that they're talking about is part of the interview process, because they're talking about it within the context of teachers moving from California or New York to Oklahoma cities and Oklahoma schools. So I'm assuming that this is part of the onboarding, or I assume this is prior to the onboarding process and that this is part of the interview process. There are pretty strict rules about what employers are and aren't allowed to ask you in the interview process. They aren't allowed to ask you certain explicitly political questions. They aren't allowed to ask you certain things about your personal identity and personal life. I don't know the exact rules or whatnot, but I have a decent idea of what those rules are. I just wonder if and to what extent this test might violate some of those rules about how you're not explicitly supposed to ask somebody about their political leanings prior to getting a job or something in the interview process. It's against the rules. I just wonder if this runs afoul of those rules or not. I'm interested to learn more about this test. PragerU CEO Marissa Streit told CNN that several questions relate to undoing the damage of gender ideology. Oh. Anybody who uses the phrase gender ideology, I'm immediately skeptical about what their viewpoint is on this. My immediate thought is that they are probably not connected to the scientific consensus about trans people and gender and whatnot. Because scientists and researchers and people who are experts in the realm of gender and anthropology and things like that, they don't use the phrase gender ideology because it doesn't really make sense, right? It implies a whole bunch of unscientific assumptions and viewpoints. Jonathan Zimmerman, an educated historian who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, said the contract with Prager to test out-of-state teachers is a watershed moment. Instead of Prager simply being a resource that you can draw in an optional way, Prager has become institutionalized as part of the state system. He said there is no other way to describe it. According to Zimmerman, the American Historical Association found that a minority of 7th to 12th grade teachers were relying on textbooks for everyday learning and are instead using online resources such as PragerU. I think what we're now seeing in Oklahoma is something different, which is actually empowering Prager as a kind of gatekeeper for future teachers, he said. That's super dangerous. Yeah, the idea that like any teachers within the state of Oklahoma, they have to go through the PragerU mandated like filter before they're able to is just crazy, bro. It's just crazy. The American Federation of Teachers, one of the largest teachers unions in the U.S., criticized the state's move. This MAGA loyalty test will be yet another turnoff for teachers in a state already struggling with a huge shortage, said AFT President Randy Weingarten. She has been critical of Walters, who previously pushed for a revision of Oklahoma's curriculum standards to include conspiracy theories of the 2020 presidential election. Yeah, that's interesting they bring this up. I've heard that in some textbooks, and I don't know if this is in private schools, but it wouldn't blow my mind if it was in public schools in some of these backward states, that they in the textbooks in like the most recent iterations where they come up to modern history up to like the 2020 presidential election, they have it listed in the textbook that like the whole Donald Trump actually won 2020 and the election was stolen from him and all that conspiracy theory nonsense. That's super scary. I would need to see the exact textbook in question, see the wording, and I wonder if maybe they are being a little bit hyperbolic and maybe these textbooks are describing how some people think the election was stolen, but it isn't making the case that the election is stolen. But like, it wouldn't blow my mind if they were handing out textbooks that explicitly argue the election was stolen stolen against Donald Trump, is stolen by Biden, I guess. His priority should be educating students, but instead it's getting Donald Trump and other MAGA politicians to notice him, said Weingarten. Tina Ellsworth, president of the National Council for Social Studies nonprofit, also warned that the test could prevent teachers from applying for jobs. State boards of education should stay true to the values and principles of the U.S. Constitution, said Ellsworth. Imposing an ideology test to become a teacher in our great democracy is antithetical to those principles. I would think if these people are truly confident in their viewpoint, right? If they're truly confident in their right-wing ideology and their right-wing viewpoint, and these like say you're a parent and you have your kid and you fully believe that like the right-wing viewpoint is the correct one, and you don't want and therefore you don't want your kid to become a left-winger. Well, I would think that like if you really think that your viewpoint is the strongest, then it can hold up to criticism from other viewpoints. And in that sense, I would imagine that you would want your kid to receive as many like different viewpoints on things as possible, knowing that your superior mindset or your superior ideology, the right-wing ideology that you believe, will naturally rise to the top. And your kid will not only have like find their own path to the right-wing ideology, but they will have like the understanding of all the different perspectives, viewpoints on things, so that they can like have an even stronger, the foundation for which that they have their right-wing ideology is even stronger because they understand the shortcomings of all these other different perspectives. You would think if they were confident in their viewpoint in that regard, they wouldn't be so scared of like their kids being exposed to left-wing ideology or whatever. You would think that they would want their kids to experience these different viewpoints so that they can like use it as a way to build up their ideology even more, right? I don't know. It just comes off as very like very insecure about your beliefs, right? Like we're worried that our viewpoints will not win out in the marketplace of ideas or whatever, which is just like weak and sort of antithetical to the whole like tough macho like we're always the winners posturing that the Republicans and conservatives seem to be doing lately. Oklahoma Representative John Waldron said the exam was political posturing. If you want to see a textbook definition of indoctrination, how about a loyalty test for teachers, he said. It's a sad echo of a more paranoid past. Waldron, the chairman of the Oklahoma Democratic Party and a New Jersey native, said he likely would have been the target demographic for this kind of exam when he moved from Washington, D.C. to Oklahoma to teach social studies in 1999. He said the test would have made him believe the state wasn't serious about attracting quality teachers. Teachers are not rushing here from other states to teach. We've got an enormous teaching shortage, and it's not like we have a giant supply of teachers coming in from blue states anyway, said Waldron. Oklahoma schools rank 50th in the nation, according to a survey by Wallet Hub, beating only New Mexico. Wow, it's a huge shocker. The state with the education department that partners directly with PragerU is dead last in the state rankings. Wow, who would have freaking guessed? The quality of public school systems varies widely from state to state and is often a question of funding. So yeah, this is hilarious that they would do this. And it's also part and parcel with, Oklahoma being dead last in the education rankings and them wanting to partner with PragerU is not surprising. And the idea that all of the teachers for an entire state would be through this filter of PragerU, and if you're not approved by PragerU, basically you're not okay, is not only hilarious, but actually super dangerous and serious. Because imagine if that policy was implemented in all of these Southern Republican leading states, and then suddenly from elementary school onwards, only right-wing teachers are able to be there. It's super dangerous. And also the other point I made, this all just seems really insecure about your own views. I would think if you were super confident in your right-wing ideology and you think it's going to win out in the marketplace of ideas and will naturally rise to the top, you shouldn't be scared about your kid or kids being exposed to one random teacher's leftist ideology or whatever the heck that means. You wouldn't be scared of that because you would believe that the correct ideology, the right-wing ideology that you are teaching them will naturally rise to the top and beat out whatever nonsense that this left-wing, this hypothetical non-existent radical left-wing, teacher would implement or whatever. It's just all really silly. This is just really silly. AI experts return from China stunned. The U.S. grid is so weak, the race may already be over. Everywhere we went, people treated energy availability as a given, Ryu Ma wrote on Twitter after returning from a recent tour of China's AI hubs. For American AI researchers, that's almost unthinkable. In the U.S., surging AI demand is colliding with a fragile power grid, the kind of extreme bottleneck that Goldman Sachs warns could severely choke the industry's growth. In China, Ma continued, it's considered a solved problem. Ma, a renowned expert in Chinese technology and founder of the media company TechBuzz China, took her team on the road to get a first-hand look at the country's AI advancements. She told Fortune that while she isn't an energy expert, she attended enough meetings and talked to enough insiders to come away with a conclusion that should send chills down the spine of Silicon Valley. In China, building enough power for data centers is no longer up for debate. This is a stark contrast to the U.S., where AI growth is increasingly tied to debates over data center power consumption and grid limitations, she wrote on Twitter. The stakes are difficult to overstate. Data center building is the foundation of AI advancement, and spending on new centers now displaces consumer spending in terms of impact to U.S. GDP. That's concerning since consumer spending is generally 2/3 of the pie. McKinsey projects that between 2025 and 2030, companies worldwide will need to invest $6.7 trillion into new data center capacity to keep up with AI's strain. In a recent research note, Stifel Nicholas warned of a looming correction to the S&P 500, since it forecasts this data center capital expenditures boom to be a one-off build-out of infrastructure, while consumer spending is nearly on the wane. However, the clear limiting factor to the U.S.'s data center infrastructure development, according to a Deloitte industry survey, is stress on the power grid. Cities' power grids are so weak that some companies are just building their own power plants rather than relying on existing grids. This is both an indictment on our U.S. power grid and our ability, our inability to quickly build and increase our energy grid's capacity, but also I wouldn't be surprised if this was just an objectively good business and strategic decision from some of these companies' standpoints. So while to some degree I would attribute some of these companies wanting to build their own power plants to the US's shortcomings when it comes to their power grid, I think at least some of it can be attributed to just raw business decisions that would have been made regardless of the state of the US power grid. The public is growing increasingly frustrated over increasing energy bills. In Ohio, the electricity bill for a typical household has increased at least $15 a month this summer from the data centers, while energy companies prepare for a sea change of surging demand. Goldman Sachs frames the crisis simply. AI's insatiable power demand is outpacing the grid's decade-long development cycles, creating a critical bottleneck. And I wonder who's going to feel the brunt of all this, right? When a company builds a new AI data center in a big city whose power grid is already on the edge, and now it's pushed over by a solid 5-10%, and they have to make legitimate, serious cuts to people's power grids or increase people's prices or whatever. Who's going to feel the negative effect of this, right? Is it going to be the data centers that get sweetheart tax deals and excellent electricity rates that they pay far, far less per kilowatt than any average household would ever have the opportunity to? Is it going to be them, or is it going to be the average mom and pop? Is it going to be the average household whose energy bill is going to double? Or is it going to be the average household who's going to experience rolling blackouts a couple more times a year than they otherwise regularly would have, right? It's really hard to think who is going to benefit most and who is going to be harmed the most. It's really hard to come up with that one. Meanwhile, David Fishman, a Chinese electricity expert who has spent years tracking the country's energy development, told Fortune that in China, electricity isn't even a question. On average, China adds more electricity demand than the entire annual consumption of Germany every single year. Whole rural provinces are blanketed in rooftop solar, with one province matching the entirety of India's electricity supply. U.S. policymakers should be hoping China stays a competitor and not an aggressor, Fishman said, because right now they can't compete effectively on the energy infrastructure front. China has an oversupply of electricity. That seems like of all the problems to have in your society, an oversupply of electricity is one of the ones you really want to have, right? China's quiet electricity dominance, Fishman explained, is the result of decades of deliberate overbuilding and investment in every layer of the power sector, from generation to transmission to next-generation nuclear. The country's reserve margin has never dipped below 80 to 100% nationwide, meaning it has consistently maintained at least twice the capacity it needs. Wow, that is tremendous, man. That is crazy. The country's reserve margin has never dipped below 80 to 100% nationwide, meaning it has twice the capacity it needs. That's crazy, bro. With my understanding of the necessarily increasing energy consumption demands of computers and now AI data centers and whatever else new technology that's going to come in the next couple decades, this is the exact sort of thing. This should be the model, right? This is the exact sort of thing that you should be shooting for. You should be aiming to have your energy grid be double what is necessary, so you have sufficient overhead to do whatever the heck you want. That seems like that's awesome, man. That's something on this regard. Score 1 China, the US 0. They have so much available space that instead of seeing AI data centers as a threat to grid stability, China treats them as a convenient way to soak up oversupply, he added. And also, just basic supply and demand. If your power grid has double the necessary capacity, then I would imagine that the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity for like the average person would necessarily go down because of the whole, just basic economic supply and demand. If the supply is way higher than the demand, then the price necessarily will be lower. That level of cushion is unthinkable in the United States, where regional grids typically operate with a 15% reserve margin and sometimes less, particularly during extreme weather, Fishman said. In places like California or Texas, officials often issue warnings about red flag conditions when demand is projected to strain the system. This leaves little room to absorb the rapid load increases AI infrastructure requires, Fishman noted. The gap in readiness is stark. While the U.S. is already experiencing political and economic fights over whether the grid can keep up, China is operating from a position of abundance. Even if AI demand in China grows so quickly, renewable projects can't can't keep pace, Fishman said. The country can tap idle coal plants to bridge the gap while building more sustainable sources. It's not preferable, he admitted, but it's doable. By contrast, the U.S. would have to scramble to bring on new generation capacity, often facing years-long permitting delays, local opposition, and fragmented market rules, he said. Underpinning the hardware advantage is a difference in governance. In China, energy planning is coordinated by long-term technocratic policy that defines the market's rules before investments are made, Fishman said. This model ensures infrastructure build out happens in anticipation of demand, not in reaction to it. Not that like China is a pure socialist communist society, but they're far, far closer to what I would call socialist or communist or whatever than the United States. And in that sense, this is one of the things I've never really fully understood about the dynamic between capitalism versus socialism, sort of in the colloquial way we put it. Capitalism necessarily lends itself to more short-term planning, right? Think of like a company and how companies typically operate on a quarterly basis, maybe bi-quarterly, and maybe yearly on some special like types of businesses that are reliant on more longer business cycles. And theoretically, if socialism and communism is sort of like the mirror of capitalism, it's the other side of the coin, then I would imagine that they are far more oriented towards long-term planning, which I would think from a country standpoint, right? From literally the most macro meta position you can possibly be analyzing things from, right? Top down, the entire government, the entire country, the entire economy and everything. I would think you would want to prioritize long-term planning, a la like I think would be indicative with socialism and communism than would be with capitalism, right? Especially when it comes to things like the power grid. It's just when I see people criticize socialism and communism or whatever, I almost never see them bring up like positives, right? Because it's a pros and cons, right? It's not like capitalism in our American economic system is objectively better in every conceivable way in comparison to like the Chinese socialist communist in the way it, interconnects with its government. It's just not correct. And so you can point out totally fair, valid criticisms of the way that they do their government, the way their economy is structured, everything about that. But like to only offer criticisms and never acknowledge potential benefits, like maybe being more long-term planning oriented, which might lend itself better to fleshing out a good power grid. And I just think long-term, I almost never see people mention the pro of having a more long-term, the ability to plan a bit more long-term than would be in a capitalist democracy, American style system. I just almost never see people mention that positive. And obviously that positive wouldn't only apply to the power grid, right? Any government top-down large system that affects the economy or the way the government functions or how way people access certain types of services is going to necessarily benefit from a more long-term planning approach and mindset than just short-term. What benefits me most in the 4 years when I'm in office so I can get reelected and whatnot, They're set up to hit grand slams, Fishman noted. The U.S. at best can get on base. In the U.S., large-scale infrastructure projects depend heavily on private investment, but most investors expect a return within 3 to 5 years, far too short for power projects that can take a decade to build and pay off. I wonder if this is maybe part of the reason why we don't see quite as much nuclear power development in the United States compared to some other countries, is this short-term planning viewpoint, right? I watched some pseudo documentary piece talking about the profitability differences between like building a new natural gas power plant and a new nuclear power plant, and how it only takes that gas power plant maybe like 10 years to make its return on investment and become purely profitable, while the nuclear power plant, because it has a significantly higher upfront cost, takes much, much longer to reach that point of break even and then profitability. I think it was a solid like 20 or 30 years. And so, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I know like regulations and sort of just an anti-nuclear sentiment we have is a big reason why we don't see nuclear development quite as much in the U.S. energy grid. But I wonder if it would intuitively make sense if this sort of short-term 3 to 5 year planning cycle mindset that is indicative of our U.S. capitalist system or whatever plays at least some factor in why we don't see as much nuclear as we would maybe hope. Capital is really biased towards shorter-term returns, he said, absolutely, noting Silicon Valley has funneled billions into the nth iteration of software as a service, while energy projects fight for funding. In China, by contrast, the state directs money towards strategic sectors in advance of demand, accepting not every project will succeed, but ensuring the capacity is in place when it's needed. Without public financing to de-risk long-term bets, he argued, the U.S. political and economic system is simply not set up to build the grid of the future. Cultural attitudes reinforce this approach. In China, renewables are framed as a cornerstone of the economy because they make sense economically and strategically, not because they carry moral weight. Yeah, this is one of the things I don't understand about, like, if you're a conservative-minded person, right? Like, say your brain is in conservative economic land, okay? I would think that would be super in favor of renewables because there is basically zero input to infinite output, right? When you have like a natural gas power plant, for instance, right? You have to constantly be feeding more natural gas into this power plant, right? And that costs you money. Say it's $100 per kilogram of natural gas or whatever. I don't know what the rate would be, but you have to continually pay that forever as long as this power plant is open. But if you have like a wind power plant or like a solar power plant or something, that supply is infinite and free, right? Wind is just going to keep going forever and it's going to be free. The sun is going to keep going basically forever and it's going to be free. And so I would think and obviously these things do have some maintenance cost and some infrastructure cost and yada, yada, yada. But put that aside, I would think from a purely economic brain perspective, you would want the business model and the infrastructure setup that requires as little, or in this case, zero inputs in relation to the amount of outputs that it gives, right? That's something I've just never understood. Why would you prefer a coal or natural gas or fossil fuel centered power plant if it is like arguably economically worse? And that's the position that so many of these anti-fossil fuels people are coming from, right? They try and pretend like they're coming from some economic position. But in reality, I would imagine that the economic position actually would be most in favor of the renewable energy and the energy systems that require no input, like solar and wind and hydro. And I would argue nuclear is effectively in that category because the input is so cheap, right? I know you have to keep buying uranium or plutonium fuel rods to put inside the nuclear power plant or whatever. But my understanding is that those are extraordinarily cheap in comparison to other input fuel systems like coal or natural gas or whatever. Coal use isn't cast as a sign of villainy, as it would be among some circles in the U.S. It's simply seen as outdated. This pragmatic framing, Fishman argued, allows policymakers to focus on efficiency and results rather than political battles. For Fishman, the takeaway is blunt. Without a dramatic shift in how the U.S. builds and funds its energy infrastructure, China's lead will only widen. The gap in capability is only going to continue to become more obvious and grow in the coming years, he said. So yeah, all of this is pretty concerning and definitely consistent with what I have been hearing from other random sources here and there about how the U.S. is not keeping up with, our projected demand for electricity goes like this. And our projected energy capacity is basically flat or only going up at a very, very small rate, which means that we're going to reach a serious inflection point, right? Where this is kind of going up at a more steady, slow rate, and our demand, especially within the context of new AI data centers and whatnot, is gonna keep going up, and they're gonna hit an inflection point, and it's gonna become a serious problem. Also, the U.S., I never knew this. I didn't know that China's reserve margin has never dipped below 80 to 100% nationwide, meaning it has consistently maintained at least twice the capacity it needs. I had no idea about that, and that should be like one of those things that's like a new goal, right? If we're trying to lay out explicitly good, like a path forward to how to improve the country, one new thing I'd put on the line item would be modeling China's power grid planning, in which we shoot for having a double capacity so that we have this 80 to 100% overhead at all times, so that we can, say some new technology a la AI comes out that demands a tremendous amount of energy. We have the capacity to very quickly build up that sector of the economy and get a leg up on the rest of the world economically. While in the current situation, if some new piece of technology came out a la AI that required a significant increase in our power capacity to be able to keep up economically with the rest of the world, we would fall behind necessarily, because our ability to flesh out and build up and expand our energy grid right now is just not there. Ohio requires buses for private school kids. Public school students have to find their own ride. School districts are responsible for transporting private and charter school kids, leaving thousands of public school students behind. For about 2,000 students attending high school in Dayton, Ohio, there won't be a bus in sight when they walk out of the door for the beginning of the school year this week. Ohio law means that public school districts, such as Dayton's, are responsible for transporting students who attend private and charter schools. When they fail to do so, they risk fines of millions of dollars. A shortage of drivers and buses, combined with the threats of fines, means that public school districts in Dayton and around Ohio find themselves relegating their own students to the back of the transportation line. I'm going to have to use Uber, and it's going to cost me $25 to $30 a day to get to and from school, says Castillo. In wintertime, when demand is higher, it's probably going to be more. At 180 school days over the course of a year, that's thousands of dollars he is set to fork out from his own pocket. For the past several years, school administrators in Dayton, Cincinnati, and elsewhere have been trying to get around the problem of issuing students with bus passes for public transportation. Cincinnati and elsewhere have been trying to get around the problem by issuing students with bus passes for public transportation. I don't necessarily see any problem with that. I mean, ideally, yeah, you'd have them be in a school bus, but at least it's something, right? And I think it probably, I normally don't like to make this kind of point, but I would think that, being forced to use the public transportation buses instead of your school buses might teach them some independence lessons, something that kids these days I think are lacking. So I think idea. Look, yeah, you would rather your kids going on a school bus than a public transport bus, but I think insofar as it's used to fill in the gaps, I think it's fine for them to do that. But children riding public buses have reported being subjected to a variety of dangers. Public transportation administrators have also reported difficulties trying to serve the public and thousands of students all at once. See, what I don't get about this is, if you think the public bus system is too dangerous for children to ride, then, isn't that an indictment on the public bus? Doesn't that mean that you're doing a poor job of securing the bus system, right? That doesn't tell me, my takeaway from that isn't don't send kids on the public school buses because it's dangerous. My obvious takeaway is, fix the public bus system so it's not dangerous. Ugh. But they don't want to do that because fixing the public bus system helps poor people, and they don't want to do that. The situation came to a tragic head on the morning of April 4th when 18-year-old Alfred Hale III was shot dead at the public bus hub in downtown Dayton while en route to class at Dunbar High School. Shortly after Hale's killing, Ohio lawmakers introduced a law making it illegal for Dayton public schools to buy public bus vouchers for students. The burden... Ooh, yeah, wait. So you can't say they have to provide public buses, like school buses to private and charter schools, not have enough buses for the public schools as well, and then not allow them to gap fill by providing bus passes to the public bus system. That seems like a recipe for how could they even let something like that happen? How are they not thinking about those students in the public schools who would be caught in the middle of all this? How is that not the major, not only a consideration of all of this, but the prime consideration of all of this? The burden of getting children to school now falls on students' parents, grandparents, local churches, and charities, say officials. Families who choose to continue to have their students use public buses to get to and from school will have to fork out at least $540 per high school student a year. There seems to be an aggressive approach to the most vulnerable families and people in America, says DPS Superintendent David Lawrence. Not only is it unfair, it's onerous that public schools have to provide transportation to non-public school students. That seems absolutely crazy to me. I don't understand why you would ever implement a rule saying the public schools have to provide the school buses for the, like, I really can't, I'm trying really hard to come up with a steel man for that. What could possibly be the steel man for like forcing the public school system to provide school buses for private and charter schools? The only thing I can think of is that maybe it would make sense if you don't trust these private and charter schools to facilitate their own busing, right? You can place a rule that says they have to provide busing to their kids, to whoever students are going there. But that makes no sense, right? If they are okay with these private and charter schools existing in the first place, of taking in these kids and having their own curriculums and being in charge of these children for 8 hours a day or whatever, the idea that you wouldn't trust them to facilitate their own busing is doesn't make any sense. The only reason I can think for this is cynical reasons, right? It's that like the Oklahoma legislature is so full of private school parents and people who don't believe in like the importance and the right for people to access good public schools, that they're just like, screw it, we don't care. I guess they're just okay with screwing over public school students. I mean, that's literally the only takeaway from this is that. And how could you argue that this wasn't like, you would have a hard time arguing that this wasn't a feature, that this was a bug and not a feature, right? Like, how do you know that this wasn't really the goal the whole time, right? That they don't like all these leftists in these cities and they want to basically punish them. Like, this is just so ass backwards. And why would you not consider these people that are caught in the middle? How do you think it's okay for private schools to have busing funded by the state, but like school buses come to them and pick them up, take them to school by the state in these private and charter schools? That being the case, literally at the expense of public school kids, there seems to be an aggressive approach to the most vulnerable families and people in America, says DPS's Superintendent David Lawrence. Not only is it unfair, it's onerous that public schools have to provide transportation to non-public school students. I just can't even imagine. I can't think of a good faith reason as to why you would implement that rule, other than like, I can't think of a good faith reason. I can think of bad faith, cynical reasons. What's happening in Ohio is a result of a wider effort by conservative politicians to push for more children to attend charter and private schools, many of which are run by religious organizations. Republican politicians hold a supermajority across Ohio's legislature and have built up a $1 billion fund in the form of vouchers for families who want to send their students to private and charter schools. Imagine if they took that $1 billion in voucher funding or whatever that my understanding is just sitting in an account waiting to be claimed by people who are going to private and charter schools. Just imagine if they pumped that $1 billion back into their actual public schools and, oh my God, crazy idea, bought more school buses so that so that your stupid rule you implemented, how the public schools in these localities have to provide busing for these private and charter schools, you could, I don't know, buy more buses and fix the problem. This is the sort of thing that makes me think this is a feature, not a bug, that this was explicitly the point of all of this. They wanted to degrade the public school experience so that more people are funneled into the private and charter school system. Ohio is not alone. Republican-dominated state legislatures have been pushing for or have already enacted laws that see billions of dollars of taxpayer money directed to funding private school voucher systems in Texas, Florida, Iowa, Tennessee, and elsewhere. In Pennsylvania and Minnesota, where political control is largely split between Democrats and Republicans, public schools are required to provide transportation for students attending non-public schools. In January, Donald Trump signed an executive order steering taxpayer funds away from public schools to private schools. Many in Democratic-leaning cities say they are being targeted. Yeah, that's what I think. I really think that there is at least some desire on the part of these Republicans and conservatives to literally punish these Democratic leading cities, right? They are totally fine with degrading the public school experience but only in these Democratic leaning cities, right? Like, they're not okay with that on principle, but when it comes to these Democratic leaning cities, they're totally fine with punishing them in this weird way. It's just a super weird anti-American mindset, right? It's a sort of mindset that doesn't see a fellow American that lives in a big city or whatever, lives in Dallas or New York or Miami or whatever, that you don't see them as part of your ilk, that you don't see them, you don't think of yourself as a fellow American standing next to them. You think of them as a totally, like, basically as a different, someone from a different country. And in that sense, you're totally fine with targeting them and punishing them in a way that you maybe wouldn't be okay with more broadly to other Americans. In Cincinnati, children as young as 13 are being forced to use public transportation to get to and from school due to funding shortages that this year will see more than 100 yellow bus routes cut. See, how can you be doing all this? How can you implement a rule that says you have to provide buses for public, private, and charter schools, and then not buy more buses, and then, at the same time you cut bus routes? In Columbus, actually, I take that back. Maybe the bus cuts were because of this whole paradigm and that they have to divert some of these yellow buses that otherwise would have gone to public schools. They have to divert them to private schools or whatever. Maybe that's the reason why they're cutting routes. I don't know. About 1.8 million, or 80% of all school-going students in Ohio, attend public schools. It's simple. If we do not have to bus non-public school students on our transportation, we could transport every single one of our K-12 students on yellow buses, says Jocelyn Reinard, a member of the Dayton Public School Board. DPS transports between 4,000 and 5,000 charter and private school students every school day. It's a direct result of the legislation from the extremist Republicans at the Ohio State House mandating that we must transport non-public students as well as public students in our district. But Republican politicians disagree. I am itching to hear their defense of this. Okay, I'm itching. I am desperate. Oh, please. I'm so excited to hear what they have to say. I have a feeling it's going to be so ridiculous. I can't even imagine. We had an 18-year-old get shot and killed. The environment for the students is not good down there. The NAACP interviewed the children. They don't want to ride the public transportation buses. They want to ride the yellow school buses, says Phil Plummer, a Republican Party state representative who spearheaded the budget amendment banning DPS from giving its students public bus vouchers. Plummer says he and others found 25 school buses that DPS could purchase. They decided not to transport their kids, he says. One thing I just thought of is, if you're going to reference this 18-year-old being killed at the bus stop waiting for their public bus voucher because of the yellow school bus wasn't available, right? If you're going to think about this statistically, right? Yes, this is one guy that's got killed. And let's say maybe even there's a few more that they aren't listing in this article, right? Let's pretend a handful have gotten killed in this manner. Well, taking a yellow school bus to school is significantly safer than driving in an individual car, I would imagine. And so I would speculate that if you forced every single one of those students that would have otherwise gone on a yellow school bus to take private transportation of some regard, either their parents drive them or they have to walk or whatever else it may be, that more of them will die as a result of that than the couple or the single or a couple that get killed waiting at a bus stop, using the public bus transportation system, right? You understand what I'm saying? That that the increase in risk that you necessarily will take on by having to take other forms of transportation in lieu of the yellow school bus, that it will result in more death and destitution than the example that he's giving of this one 18-year-old getting shot waiting at a bus stop. DPS administrators, who pay drivers the highest rates in the region, say about 70 buses would be required to meet the need, a number that could take up to 2 years to procure. Lawrence said the process of buying buses and training drivers is not simple. It's an 18-month cycle. Buses are $150,000 to $190,000 each to buy, and ones with backup cameras and air conditioning are even more expensive. Then drivers have to take at least 10 tests before they become fully qualified, he says. With the law coming into effect just months before the new school year, parents, students, and public school managers have been left in a difficult situation. I'm a single dad raising 2 kids on my own. We all have to be at school at the same time. That's a big dilemma, says William Johnson, an educator at DPS whose daughter is no longer able to get to school using a bus provided by or paid for the district. I'm lucky that my 80-year-old father is going to help out taking them to school, but I ask the state, please come up with a solution. We're going to lose a whole generation of kids if this continues. I also wouldn't be surprised if there are at least a good number of students that don't have any sort of reasonable alternative mode of transportation to the school. Maybe they have deadbeat parents and they don't have any grandparents or uncles or anybody else that's able to take them to school, and maybe the walk is unreasonably long or something, right? This could very tangibly result in students sort of being forced out of school in a way, and could result in worse educational outcomes as a result, right? You might have whole groups of people that just stop going to school at sophomore, junior year because they don't have a ride to school and there isn't really anything else they can do. Cynically, Republicans are generally okay with that because they understand that our current system of economics, our current American capitalist system, is reliant to some degree upon an underclass to do all those low-rung jobs that most people don't want to do. But yeah, this is all just insane, and to me just screams bad faith, right? How could you even why would you prevent the schools from gap filling the lack of proper yellow school buses by providing public bus vouchers? I just can't even conceive of wanting to ban that practice, right? Prevent these cities and these localities from gap filling, but then don't do anything else to address the problem of these students not having access to transportation to school, right? It's like it's like they didn't think about these public school students that would get caught in the middle and not have transportation from home to school. It's like they didn't even think about them at all, which is just gross, man. If that's supposed to be their whole job, they're the education department in Oklahoma. Their whole job is supposed to serve the school children of the state, right? So much of this just screams bad faith, just screams we want to funnel kids into private schools. We are totally okay with diminishing the public school student experience. We're okay with punishing these democratic areas by reducing their, by diminishing their public schools' capacity or ability to teach kids or whatever. Let's imagine for a second that you're one of the Republicans that you want to implement the change that bans localities from providing public bus vouchers to gap fill, right? I would be the very first thing I would be thinking of if I was in that weird headspace is, oh, those people that are going to get caught in the middle. How can I explain this away? How can I address these people? How can we fix this problem? How can we not have this be a huge how can this not be a bad thing politically? How can we turn this into a good thing, right? But they don't seem to be doing any of that. They didn't mention at all the kids that are going to get caught in the middle and not have access to transportation, right? He doesn't mention it at all. He just mentions that we found some buses and that we could do it. But it doesn't matter. What does that buy you? What, $1.25 and that will buy you a candy bar at the store, right? It means nothing if you say, I see buses over there. We could do this. We could do that. But then you don't do it. And it's your whole job as the education department person to sort of make sure this gets done, right? It doesn't seem to me like they're trying very hard to solve the problem, right? I don't know. I would think that I almost guarantee you they would take a different approach, or they would at least make some statements about this, directly addressing these people that are caught in the middle. Russia found 1,000 old tanks in Siberia. They miss when they move, but it's all that's left. After 42 months of grueling fighting in Ukraine, Russia's stocks of modern armored vehicles are low. So low, in fact, that Russian technicians are pulling out of long-term storage derelict tanks that, until now, were widely considered unfit for combat. Closely inspecting recent satellite imagery of Uralvagonzavod, open source analyst Jompy spotted something he'd long anticipated in Russian tank losses exceeded 4,000 earlier this year. That's as many tanks as Russia had in frontline service before widening its war on Ukraine in February 2022. Just like that, there are a lot of likely T-72As parked in the yards outside UVZ now. Jompy wrote, using the abbreviation for blah, 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 When tanks oh yeah, UVZ now. Jumpy wrote using the abbreviation for Alvagno. Oh, I'm not. I'm gonna use that abbreviation now too. When tanks appear outside UVZ, it's usually because they're gradually being brought inside the factory for refurbishment and possibly upgrade before being shipped off to the frontline regiments, including those fighting in Ukraine. The 46-ton three-person T-72A isn't the oldest T-72 variant, but it's close. Just one model of T-72, the Ural, preceded the T-72 into Soviet service in the early 1970s. Russian industry produced thousands of T-72 Urals and T-72As, but much improved the T-72B with a stabilized 125mm gun, thicker armor, and a more powerful engine succeeded it in the 1980s. The older T-72s went into storage at bases such as the 349th Tank Storage Base in Russia's Topchitsky district 2,000 kilometers from Ukraine, and there they remained for decades, useful only as sources of spare parts, until Ukrainian mines, artillery, missiles, and drones wiped out an entire generation of more modern tanks. With UVZ building just around 300 or so of the latest T-90M tanks annually, the Kremlin has had little choice but to dip into stocks of very old T-72s in order to partially replace its tank losses in Ukraine. The 40-year-old T-72Bs began arriving at UVZ by the dozens earlier this year, but there were just a few hundred T-72Bs in storage. There are around 1,000 T-72 Urals and T-72As. As recently as last summer, Hai Marsed, another open source analyst, concluded that first-generation T-72s weren't of much use as long as Russia still had some of the slightly newer but still very old T-80Bs, T-80BVs, and T-72Bs in storage. I expect that at some point they will have to create an upgrade program for these tanks. Hai Marsed wrote about the T-72As. That should be a sign that there aren't many T-72Bs, T-80BVs left in storage. The sign has appeared. The T-72Bs and other 1980s vintage tanks are running out. Now it's the T-72A's turn to fight in Ukraine on those increasingly rare occurrences when the Russians risk tanks along the drone-patrolled front line. How many of the 1,000 or so rusty early model of T-72s are still reliable after decades in open storage is unclear. It's equally unclear how much Russia will invest in their refurbishment and upgrades. The T-72As lack many of the features that makes a modern tank modern, in particular stabilized main guns that are accurate even when a tank is moving. Ukraine's oldest frontline tanks, its Leopard 1A5s, were last upgraded in the 1980s, but even they have stabilized guns. The T-72A's impending return to frontline service is the latest evidence of a steady demechanization of the Russian army as it suffers catastrophic losses in heavy equipment in Ukraine. The T-72A's resurrection doesn't mean the Russians are losing, however. What the Russian armies lack in modern tanks, it more than makes up for with manpower. These days, Russian regiments in Ukraine mostly attack on motorcycles or on foot. They suffer heavy losses, usually totaling more than 20,000 killed and wounded in a month. But with generous signing bonuses and deceptive contracts, the Kremlin manages to recruit 30,000 fresh troops a month. They fight without modern tanks, but they still fight, and they can still push back Ukraine's own manpower-starved brigades. So yeah, this article seems maybe a little bit misleading, right? It's not all they have left. They're still very much producing the new tanks, and they still have tons in reserve that are of varying degrees of quality and wear. But it does seem like if they're pulling out a whole bunch of these unstabilized main gun tanks to either send to the front lines or to scrap for parts, does show that they are at least to some degree desperate, right? I don't think that they would be doing that if they had the ability to produce as many brand new modern tanks as they wanted to. I have a hard time believing that they would be scrapping and implementing these old unstabilized gun tanks if that was the case. Why a NASA satellite that scientists and farmers rely on may be destroyed on purpose. The Trump administration has asked NASA employees to draw up plans to end at least 2 major satellite missions, according to current and former NASA staffers. If the plans are carried out, one of the missions would be permanently terminated because the satellite would burn up in the atmosphere. The data the 2 missions collect is widely used, including by scientists, oil and gas companies, and farmers who need detailed information about carbon dioxide and crop health. They are the only 2 federal satellite missions that were designed and built specifically to monitor planet-warming greenhouse gases. It is unclear why the Trump administration seeks to end the missions. The equipment in space is state-of-the-art and is expected to function for many more years, according to scientists who worked on the missions. It is unclear why the Trump administration seeks to end the missions. It is not unclear why the Trump administration seeks to end the missions. Trump believes climate change is a hoax, okay? He talks about like 5G towers and how windmills mess with your brain. And he talks about how like windmills are bad for birds and windmills in the ocean are bad for he's made a whole bunch of lunatic, crazy claims about renewable energy, right? He has made it very clear over the 8 years that he's been doing, or the 10 years that he's been doing this political dance, that he is not in favor of renewables and that he is openly hostile towards them. So it's not confusing why he would do this thing. It is very much in line with his viewpoint on all this. An official review by NASA in 2023 found that the data are of exceptionally high quality and recommended continuing the mission for at least 3 years. Both missions, known as the Orbiting Carbon Observatories, measure carbon dioxide and plant growth around the globe. They use identical measurement devices, but one device is attached to a standalone satellite while the other is attached to the International Space Station. The standalone satellite would burn up in the atmosphere if NASA pursued plans to terminate the mission. NASA employees who work on the 2 missions are making what the agency calls Phase F plans for both carbon monitoring missions, according to David Crisp, a longtime NASA scientist who designed the instruments and managed the missions until he retired in 2022. Phase F plans lay out options for terminating NASA missions. Crisp says NASA employees making those termination plans have reached out to him for his technical expertise. What I have heard is direct communications from people who are making those plans, who weren't allowed to tell me that that's what they were told to do, but they were allowed to ask me questions, Crisp said. They were asking me very sharp questions. The only thing that would have motivated those questions was somebody told them to come up with a termination plan. 3 other academic scientists who used data from the missions confirmed that they too have been contacted with questions related to mission termination. All 3 asked for anonymity because they are concerned that speaking about the mission termination plans publicly could endanger the jobs of the NASA employees who contacted them. 2 current NASA employees who confirmed that NASA mission leaders were told to make termination plans for projects that would lose funding under President Trump's proposed budget for the next fiscal year, or FY 2026, which begins October 1st. The employees asked to remain anonymous because they were told they would be fired if they revealed the request. Presidential budget proposals are wish lists that often bear little resemblance to final congressional budgets. The Orbiting Carbon Observatory missions have already received funding from Congress through the end of 2025 fiscal year, which ends September 30th. Draft budgets that Congress is currently considering for next year keep NASA funding basically flat. But it's not clear whether these specific missions will receive funding again, or if Congress will pass a budget before current funding expires on September 30th. Last week, NASA announced it will consider proposals from private companies and universities that are willing to take on the cost of maintaining the device that is attached to the International Space Station, as well as another device that measures ozone in the atmosphere. In July, congressional Democrats sent a letter to acting NASA Administrator Sean Duffy, warning his agency not to terminate the missions that Congress has funded and arguing that the White House Office of Management and Budget and its director Russ Vought are overstepping by directing NASA and other agencies to stop spending money that Congress has already appropriated. This administration has been doing that a whole bunch, though, right? Like Congress appropriates money. That money needs to be spent on this. And then Trump just and the executive just comes out and says, no, we're not going to do that. we're just not going to do that, which makes no sense, right? Because it's Congress that appropriated the money. It's Congress that has the power to say whether or not that sort of thing gets done. It's not the executive, right? So the Trump administration is forcing the proposed cuts in its FY26 budget request on already appropriated FY25 funds. This is illegal. Yes, my understanding is that that the executive does not have the power to just cut funding appropriated by Congress like that. In the past, Vought has been vocal about cutting what he sees as inappropriate spending on projects related to climate change. Before he joined the Trump administration, Vought authored sections of the Heritage Foundation Project 2025's Vought authored sections of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 roadmap for remaking the federal government. That doesn't surprise me at all that there is a direct connection between the guy that's making these weird choices and the Heritage Foundation. Who would have guessed? Also, it says, in the past, Vought has been vocal about cutting what he sees as inappropriate spending on projects related to climate change. Okay. So to me, that implies to me that he is like an anti-climate change person. He doesn't believe it's real, and he thinks it's some sort of weird hoax to funnel money into corrupt organizations for corrupt reasons, right? If he genuinely believes that the case, you'd think that he would be in favor of this sort of satellite project that provides very clear, indisputable data about all of this, right? If he believed that was the case, then he would be in favor of the satellite going up there and then proving him correct that, oh, actually there is no climate change. Oh, this satellite proves that we don't see the climate change like we thought, or this climate change is consistent with ice age cycles and it isn't caused by man or whatever. You would think that he would be in favor of like a monitoring process, right? Because this sort of like, how could you possibly argue that a monitoring process is inappropriate spending? It's not like we're doing something about it. This is literally trying to establish like a scientific baseline about what is natural and what isn't natural, and therefore should we do something about that? In that document, Vought wrote that the Biden administration's climate fanaticism will need a whole of government unwinding, and argued that federal regulators should make it easier for commercial satellites to be launched. I don't understand where the connection between making, I don't even know why they mention he wants to make it easier for commercial satellites to be launched. I don't understand what the link to that is at all, but okay. I wonder if he means, well, actually, hold on, I take that back for a second. Wait a minute. It is very important that we regulate the number and amount and who can send satellites up into the stratosphere, because all it takes is one bad satellite with bad directions and for it to fall apart or crash into another satellite to create a chain effect where then you have a debris field of satellites all floating around in the same sort of like orbit area, all potentially hitting a bunch of other satellites and whatnot. I mean, this has been described for a while, this sort of runaway scenario in which like all it would take is a couple of these satellites, because we have thousands, tens of thousands of them up there, all orbiting at a similar rate, at a similar radius from the Earth. So all it would take is a few of them to crash into each other to create a debris field that just floods the zone and then destroys almost all, if not all, of the satellites up there. So that is just one reason off the top of my mind that it would make sense to make it not easy for commercial satellites to be sent up there, and a good reason why we should not make it easier, and that it would be a bad idea to make it easier for commercial satellites to be launched. So, the data from these missions is even more valuable than intended. The missions are called orbiting carbon observatories because they were originally designed to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But soon after they launched, scientists realized that they were also accidentally measuring plant growth on Earth. Basically, when plants are growing, photosynthesis is happening in their cells, and that photosynthesis gives off a very specific wavelength of light. The OCO instruments in space measure that light all over the planet. NASA and others have turned this happy accident into an incredibly valuable set of maps of plant photosynthesis around the world, explains Scott Denning, a longtime climate scientist at Colorado State University who worked on the OCO mission and is now retired. Lo and behold, we also get these lovely high-resolution maps of plant growth, he says, and that's useful to farmers, useful to rangeland and grazing, and drought monitoring, and forest mapping, and all kinds of things, in addition to the CO2 measurements. For example, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and many private agricultural consulting companies use the data to forecast and track crop yield, drought conditions, and more. The information can also help predict future political instability, since crop failures are a major driver of mass migration all over the world. For example, persistent drought in Honduras is one factor that has led many farmers there to migrate north, NPR reporting found. And damage to crops and livestock from extreme weather in northern Africa has contributed to migration from that region. The carbon dioxide data that the instruments were originally designed to collect has revolutionized scientists' understanding of how quickly carbon dioxide is collecting in the atmosphere. That's because measuring carbon dioxide with instruments in various locations on the Earth's surface, as scientists have been doing since the 1950s, doesn't provide information about the whole planet. Satellite data, on the other hand, covers the entire Earth. And that data showed some surprising things. 50 years ago, we thought the tropical forests were like a huge vacuum cleaner, sucking up carbon dioxide, Denning explains. Now we know they're not. Instead, boreal forests in the northern latitudes suck up a significant amount of carbon dioxide, the satellite data shows, and the patterns of which areas absorb the planet-warming gas and how much they absorb are continuously changing as the climate changes. The value of these observations is just increasing over time, explains Anna Michalak, a climate researcher at Carnegie Science and Stanford University. These are missions that are still providing critical information. The cost of maintaining 2 OCO satellite missions up in space is a small fraction of the amount of money taxpayers already spent to design and launch the instruments. That completely makes sense. Yeah, once it's up in the air, what the heck? There isn't all that much that you need to do, right? You send them up there, and these things are made to last almost forever. Not forever, but to last a very long time and to be pretty self-sustaining. The 2 missions cost about $750 million to design, build, and launch, according to David Crisp, the retired NASA scientist, and that number is even higher if you include the cost of an initial failed rocket launch that sent an identical carbon dioxide measuring instrument into the ocean in 2009. By comparison, maintaining both OCO missions in orbit costs about $15 million per year, Crisp says. That money covers the cost of downloading the data, maintaining a network of calibration sensors on the ground, and making sure the standalone satellite isn't hit by space debris, according to Crisp. Just from an economic standpoint, it makes no economic sense to terminate NASA missions that are returning incredibly valuable data, Crisp says. That's what I keep coming back to, man. Like, if you were coming from this is where I come from. If you're coming from an economic standpoint at all, it makes no sense to terminate these things, especially if the lifespan of these satellites is just beginning and they have tons more time left in them and they don't need. Like, if you're going to spend $750 million, I don't care if it was the administration that came before you and you disagree with the reasons behind it. If we spent $750 million of taxpayer money to shoot up 2 satellites up there, and it only cost us like $10-15 million a year to keep them like updated and keep them and maintain them or whatnot, it is ludicrously stupid to knock them down, right? Just out of pure spite. You're just like, I hate the last administration so much. I hate climate. I think climate change is a hoax so much. We're knocking down these satellites. Even if you put aside the climate change stuff, right? This article talks about the value that these satellites have to oil companies, to crops, to all sorts of other things that aren't directly related to climate change. And so I would think even if you put aside the climate change thing entirely, that the value that these that the $15 million or so that it takes to maintain these satellites is well surpassed by the value that of the data that these satellites produce, not including that they're climate change data. So it just seems so ass backwards, the idea that it just seems like pure petty spiteness, that you're just like, I think climate change is the Hicks, and I hate the last administration. I hate that Biden guy. And honestly, and you hate the American taxpayer too. And you want to, I don't know, just waste money for wasting money's sake. Because the cost, because it's basically nothing, right? $15 million a year is within the scope of the federal government, and spending $750 million to send 2 satellites up there. $15 million a year is nothing. Okay, so you can't possibly make like an austerity argument for this. It doesn't make sense. It's not connected to economic reality. NASA's recent call for universities and companies to potentially take over the cost of maintaining the OCO instrument attached to the International Space Station suggests the agency is also considering privatizing NASA's science missions. Such partnerships raise a host of thorny questions, says Michalak, who also worked with private companies, nonprofit groups, universities, and the federal government on greenhouse gas monitoring satellite projects. On the one hand, the private sector is really starting to have a role, Malaychek said. In recent years, multiple private groups in the U.S. have launched satellites that measure methane, a potent planet-warming gas that is poorly monitored compared to carbon dioxide. Looking at it from the outside, it can look like the private sector is really picking up some of what the federal agencies were doing in terms of Earth observations, she explains. And it's true that they're contributing, but, she says, those efforts would not be possible without this underlying investment from public funding. Obviously, what private company is going to want to spend $750 billion launching 2 satellites up into space to monitor crop yields and carbon dioxide, right? There's no freaking way any company would ever spend that kind of money doing that. Yeah, this is just super weird. It's just super disconnected from economic reality, right? I just can't get over the idea that you would spend $1 billion, and even if you are furious at the Biden administration or whoever launched these satellites up there, and you believe climate change is a hoax, it still doesn't make sense to knock these satellites down, right? Because put aside climate change entirely, like I said, the value of these satellites in their crop data and all the non-climate change related data that they get from these satellites alone is enough to justify their value and their ongoing cost, let alone the tremendously important information that is the climate change data that it gets. This is just like a classic example of cutting off your nose to spite your face, right? I don't know. I can't think of any other way to put this other than cutting off your nose to spite your face. Brett Kavanaugh says he doesn't owe the public an explanation. The justice has one half of a really good idea. Justice Brett Kavanaugh defended the Supreme Court's recent practice of handing victories to President Donald Trump without explaining those decisions while speaking at a judicial conference on Thursday. For most of its history, the Supreme Court was very cautious about weighing in on any legal dispute before it arrived on its doorsteps through the often very slow process of lawyers appealing lower court decisions. There are many reasons for this caution, but one of the biggest ones is that if the justices race to decide matters, they may get them wrong. And on many legal questions, no one can overrule the court if the justices make a mistake. Beginning on Trump's first term, however, the Republican justices started throwing caution to the wind when Trump loses a case in a lower court. His lawyers often run to the court's shadow docket, a once obscure process that allows litigants to skip the line and receive an immediate order from the justices, but only if the justices agree. Unlike in ordinary Supreme Court cases argued on the merits docket, the justices do not often explain why they ruled a particular way in a shadow docket cases. Before Trump, the court was hyper-cautious about granting relief on the shadow docket because doing so often required them to decide high-stakes matters without much deliberation, full briefing, or an oral argument. Now the Supreme Court hands down emergency orders benefiting the Trump administration so often that it's just a regular part of the justice's work. The court was much more reluctant to grant similar relief to former President Joe Biden, a Democrat. Law professor Steve Vladek pointed out in late June, the court granted, at least in part, each of the last 14 shadow docket applications filed by the Department of Justice. Since then, the court handed Trump 2 more victories on its shadow docket, including a major decision permitting the Trump administration to fire close to half of the Department of Education's workforce. Though the Democratic justices frequently dissent from these shadow docket decisions, the court's Republican majority rarely explains why they cast their lot with Trump. At a judicial conference last week, Justice Elena Kagan, an Obama appointee, said that these silent decisions are a mistake. Courts are supposed to explain things, Kagan argued. They're supposed to explain things to litigants. They're supposed to explain things to the public generally. And that brings us back to Kavanaugh's remarks on Thursday, which seemed to be a direct response to Kagan and others who have offered a similar criticism of the court's unexplained pro-Trump decisions. Kavanaugh's argument for silence is pretty good, but only if you assume that the court needs to fast-track every request from Trump. Kavanaugh's case for deciding Trump cases without an explanation is fairly straightforward. The shadow docket is often the court's first opportunity to weigh in on a particular lawsuit, but it will not be the last. Typically, when the court grants shadow docket relief, that relief is only temporary, lasting while the case is being litigated to a final decision. Once the federal appeals court reaches its final decision on the matter, the losing party can seek Supreme Court review of the final decision. And if the justices decide to take up the case in this latter stage, it will receive the full deliberation, briefing, and oral argument that the Supreme Court cases have traditionally received. Kavanaugh warned that there is a risk if the court releases a majority opinion when the case reaches them on the shadow docket of a lock-in effect of making a snap judgment and putting it in writing in a written opinion that's not going to reflect the final view. What I don't understand about that, though, is of a lock-in effect. What does he mean of a lock-in effect, though, right? Like if they have the majority on the court, they can basically do whatever they want. Like they can make a decision, they can change precedent, they could change precedent and then the very next week change the precedent right back and change their minds entirely, right? There is no such thing as a lock-in effect, right? It's not like if they make a decision on one of these cases, they can't then go back and change their mind on it. Of course they can. If the majority explains itself, the argument goes, then the justices may become entrenched in a position that is incorrect, and that they would not have reached if they had considered the case for the first time after full briefing and argument. Lower courts, meanwhile, are bound by Supreme Court opinions, even when those opinions are handed down on the shadow docket. So if a majority of the justices hand down a half-baked opinion that is riddled with errors and unworkable legal standards, every other court in the country will have to apply those standards to similar future cases. Viewed through a narrow lens, Kavanaugh makes a pretty good argument. If you assume that the Supreme Court cannot simply tell Trump to wait until after the lower courts are done considering his cases before the justices get involved, as it did for nearly all litigants for most of its modern history, then Kavanaugh is right that these hastily decided cases should often be decided without an opinion. The justices should, at the very least, be briefed on all of the downside risks of deciding a case in a particular way before they issue a binding opinion that makes those risks a reality. Maybe they can't actually go back. Maybe once they make an opinion, I have a feeling like if they made an opinion, they made a ruling, and then for whatever reason they decided they want to change it like a week later, they could just have somebody like fabricate another lawsuit and then they shadow docket their way up to the front of the line. So they effectively can just go back on their word immediately. But the justices do not need to drop everything and race to hand down a decision every time that Trump lawyers ask them to do so. The court used to have a way of screening shadow docket petitions to ensure that only the ones that required their immediate attention received it. It could go back to doing things the way they were done before Trump's rise to power. The Supreme Court explained how the shadow docket is supposed to work in Enken v. Holder, which was handed down roughly a decade before the court turned its shadow docket into a fast-track complaints department for Donald Trump. Enken explained, when a litigant asks an appellate court to block a lower court's decision while the case is still ongoing, it is not enough for that litigant to demonstrate that they are likely to prevail on appeal. Someone seeking shadow docket relief, or its equivalent in a lower appeals court, must also show that they will be irreparably injured absent a stay. Often, appeals courts must also ask whether blocking the lower court's decision would substantially injure any third parties or otherwise harm the public interest. Think of it this way. Imagine that Pepsi sues Coke, wrongly claiming that it is illegal to sell Coke products in the state of Indiana. Now imagine that a trial judge issues an injunction prohibiting Coke from selling anything in that state. This injunction is illegal, and an appeals court should eventually reverse the trial court. But under Enken, Coke may not be entitled to an immediate relief before the appeals court reaches its final decision. The ban on Coke sales in Indiana, while illegal, probably won't cause any irreparable harm to Coke. When it wins on appeal, Coke can calculate how much money it would have earned if it had been allowed to do business in Indiana while the injunction was in place, and a court can potentially order Pepsi to reimburse Coke for this amount of money. Now imagine a different version of Pepsi v. Coke, where Pepsi convinces a trial judge to force Coke to reveal its secret formula for Coca-Cola syrup. Once a secret is out, it is out. So under Enken, Coke should be entitled to an immediate appeals court decision allowing it to keep its most precious trade secret confidential. As Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson explained in a pair of dissents earlier this year, however, the Republican justices appear to have abandoned Enken, at least when the Trump administration asks for shadow docket relief. In Social Security Administration v. AFSCME For example, the Republican justices ruled that DOGE, the enigmatic White House office that was once led by billionaire Elon Musk, may have immediate access to sensitive information kept by the Social Security Administration. Notably, however, when a judge asked one of Trump's lawyers what harm the government would experience if DOGE's access to this information were delayed, the lawyer did not answer, saying instead that the Trump administration would stand on the record in its current form. Okay, so the way I understand it, if I understand this explanation correctly, they would have to prove that the government will be irreparably injured absent a stay. Okay, they would have to, if they're following the NCAN standard like they used to, when the Trump administration comes in, this DOGE, and asks for access to all the Social Security Administration data, and they want immediate access to it via shadow docket relief from the Supreme Court, prior to, them just completely going sycophant to Trump, the government, so the executive and the lawyers making this claim and asking for this request, would have to prove that the government will be irreparably injured absent a stay, that there will be irreparable harm and damage caused by not granting immediate relief. Similarly, in the Trump administration's brief to the justices in AFSCME, Trump's lawyers did not even attempt to argue that it faced irreparable injury without shadow docket relief. Yeah, because you couldn't possibly make that argument, right? You couldn't argue that the government will undergo some sort of irreparable harm because DOGE doesn't have immediate access to all of the Social Security Administration's data, right? You couldn't possibly make that argument in court. And so, so the only way that they could get this passed quickly would be for the Supreme Court to completely do away with the NCAN standard of shadow docket filtering. I don't know. Filtering, I guess, is the word you could use for it. The brief devoted only one paragraph to the question of irreparable harm, and it did not identify any injury to the government that could not be unraveled by a future court order. Instead, it merely complained that the lower court order blocking DOGE's access impinges on the president's broad authority. Okay, so the Trump administration's lawyers are arguing that the NCAN standard is not the standard by which the Supreme Court should filter out shadow docket cases or not. How they mesh with the president's broad authority, right? Basically, how much does it help us in our political goals or not, right? This is purely ideological. And yet the Republican justices voted with Trump, violating NCAN in the process. Restoring NCAN would not mean that shadow docket relief was never available, or even that it would not be available to the federal government in particularly pressing cases. To understand why, consider Judge Matthew Kaczmarski's infamous decision attempting to ban the abortion drug mifepristone by rescinding the Food and Drug Administration's approval of this medication. The Supreme Court blocked Kaczmarski's decision on the shadow docket, and it was right to do so because cases involving pregnancy are a classic example of a time-sensitive matter where people will be irreparably harmed if the courts do not act quickly. If Kaczmarski's order had remained in effect, many women seeking abortions would have been unable to obtain the medically recommended treatment. Some might have undergone much more invasive procedures, such as a surgical abortion. Others may have been forced to carry their pregnancy to term. These are irreparable harms. Once a woman undergoes surgery, it is not possible to unoperate on them and then go back in time to give them the medication that they should have received in the first place. On the other end of the spectrum, consider the Republican justice's decision in Trump v. Casa, which held that lower court orders blocking Trump's attempts to strip citizenship from some Americans may have been too broad. Though Casa was the unusual shadow docket case where the Republican justices actually produced an opinion that discussed NCAN, they brushed off the question of how, exactly, the government is irreparably harmed if someone remains a citizen while this case is being litigated. CASA was the unusual shadow docket case where the Republican justices actually produced an opinion that discussed NCAN. So they're willing to discuss the concept of it, right? It's not like they're going to pretend like it doesn't exist. But then they brushed off the question of how exactly the government is irreparably harmed if someone remains a citizen while the case is being litigated. Isn't that literally what they just laid out NCAN is, right? The NCAN is the standard by which that things are immediate and that if the shadow docket injunction is not granted, that immediate irreparable harm would be done. But isn't that the whole point of NCAN? So it's so weird for them to say they discussed NCAN, but then they brushed off the whole irreparable harm part. Well, isn't that kind of what NCAN is? And then that the core of it? I don't know. It's just very strange. That was wrong. When NCAN should have required Trump to demonstrate why these Americans couldn't just be stripped of their citizenship at some latter date if he somehow prevails in this litigation. In any event, restoring NCAN would address Kavanaugh's concern about hastily drafted opinions in nearly every case. If the court started applying NCAN to Trump, most of his shadow docket petitions would simply be dismissed for seeking relief prematurely. So there would be no need for the court to issue a rushed opinion explaining whether Trump is likely to prevail once the case is fully litigated. If NCAN were still applied, the risk that lower courts would then be bound by those rushed opinions would also disappear in most cases because there would be no opinions. There would still be occasional shadow docket decisions blocking a lower court's order, like the court's very brief order in the Mifepristone case, where the justices blocked Kachmirsik's without fully explaining themselves. But those decisions would be rare. There would no longer be more than a dozen decisions handed down in just a few months, all of which favor a Republican administration, and few of which contain any legal reasoning whatsoever. I think there's a good reason why they're not explaining all this, right? They are, the Supreme Court justices are not stupid, right? They have spent decades and decades studying law and getting to the point where they are. And they are very well aware of the NCAN standard and how it exists. And I think they're very strategically not discussing it and not bringing it up in public and sort of quietly changing the rules and disregarding the precedent of NCAN so that they can basically reapply it later when a Democrat comes back into office. And this is the perfect way they can do it, right? They never officially killed NCAN. They just sort of slyly, without saying anything and acknowledging it, changed the ways and the rules that NCAN works. But then as soon as, Newsom or some other Democrat gets elected after Trump, or if a Democrat gets elected after Trump, that they're immediately going to go right back to the old NCAN standard and pretend like they never went away from it, and they'll just completely ignore all the cases which they didn't, and anytime anybody asks about it, they'll call them ridiculous or they'll just dismiss the question outright. This just seems like a perfect way for them to be super politically biased and is complicated. And imagine trying to explain the concept of the shadow docket and how all of this works to your, barely politically interested uncle, right? It's just far too complicated for most people to it's really in the weeds. And in that sense, it makes it the perfect corruption vector. Alrighty, that's all she wrote, folks. It has been Friday, August 22nd, 2025. I am Michael Winkler, and this is The Mike Wink Show, or Squeaky Wheel, one of the two. Maybe I'll rebrand. I haven't decided yet. But that's all she wrote for today, folks. Peace out.